Welcome to the first episode on Instagram of the Dough Doctor. I'm Chef Colette, and I'm here to answer your baking questions in the moment. And we have some questions to start. You all know about my epic fail last week when I absolutely overthought this whole process. And yeah, this is just so much easier. Thank you so much for joining me. So we're going to start with some of the great questions from last week. Then I'll go into questions that were asked yesterday, because on Fridays I'll always be asking for questions to start the Saturday show with. So let's get started. So last week a baker asked a great question about self-rising flour. Now if you're watching from maybe the Mid-Atlantic and the southern states, you might have self-rising flour in your baker's pantry, but in other parts of the country, it's kind of a mystery for bakers to know really what to do with it. So this baker wrote in and she said, what if she used self-rising flour instead of all-purpose in her tart dough for her French apple tart? Well, the answer is, it might be okay. But because in self-rising flour, there's a percentage of baking powder, the percentage of baking powder is on the high side because self-rising flour is marketed in areas where bakers make a lot of biscuits. It's also popular in the UK where bakers make a lot of scones. And so it might be a little bit too high for a tart crust where we usually don't add a chemical leavener. Though some very famous bakers do. If any of you heard of the baker emeritus Nick Malgari, he always adds a little baking powder in his pie and tart crust. It gives a little bit of a lift. So the answer is, it would probably be okay, but not recommended, because the percentage of baking powder is a little bit too high for that delicate tart crust. But absolutely reach for self-rising flour when you're making a batch of biscuits. So that's the question about self-rising flour. The next question that came in last week was about cakes, and this was about torting and masking and decorating cakes. Now, what torting is a fancy term for slicing our cake into layers so that we can layer buttercream and jam and lemon curd and yummy fillings in between the layers. So, is it best for the cake to be frozen when you cut it, or refrigerated and chilled when you cut it, or room temperature? Now, every cake decorator has their opinion. And in many cake decorating shops where the cakes, I'm thinking of like grocery stores, where the cakes are not made, they come in frozen, well then they're torted frozen because that's all about production. But honestly, if you, bakers, have a choice, it's best, I feel, and in my experience, which is pretty long and vast, to be torting refrigerated cakes. Room temperature cakes, they tend to tear, and that's no fun. Quick suggestion for all you cake levelers and torters and decorators out there: have a designated serrated knife just for torting your cakes. That will keep it special and sharp, and then have another one for all the bread and just the regular items that you need a serrated knife for. All right, now, how you all doing? Let me know in the chat. I see, I'm really excited that you all are here. Oh, so much fun. I've been looking forward to this for weeks. The show has been in process for a long time. All right, I digress. The next question was about hydration levels in sourdough. Always kind of confusing, right? Especially we had our sourdough boom during the lockdown. So sourdoughs, what we're looking for is we're looking for, especially sourdough lean, like if you're baking in a Dutch oven, you're making a traditional sourdough loaf, Not like sourdough panettone or sourdough brioche or sourdough croissants, but kind of a classic sourdough bread. What we're looking for is an open crumb. And that open crumb translates into a higher level of hydration, like 72%, sometimes even higher, which makes for a dough that's a little bit challenging to handle. And that is my segue into my final question from last week. The other reason why we like to have a higher hydration level in our classic sourdough boules, just thinking of a classic sourdough loaf, is because our natural yeast, when we are working with natural yeast, it doesn't multiply to the extent that our regular yeast does, like commercial yeast. That's what I was thinking of, commercial yeast. So if it's in a well-hydrated environment, it has room to swim and to grab moisture and grab nutrition. In other words, it has a better shot of developing, of opening up, and getting that fermentation process going quickly and efficiently. All right? So I hope that helps. Now there are exceptions. There are sourdough panettones and sourdough sweet doughs, but you'll notice that they get longer and multiple fermentations to deal with the fact that it takes longer for that natural yeast to fully activate. All right? So that is, oh wait, I had one more from last week, and that was about when do you fold bread doughs? As a matter of fact, I'm working on a 6-fold bread dough right now, and I'm not quite sure if I can show you, unfortunately, a little demo challenge. Maybe I'll try to bring in a second camera for next week. But in a nutshell, we fold doughs that get a short mix, which means the flour, water, yeast, and salt. If the dough isn't being autolyzed, and that means the salt is being, and sometimes the yeast are being held out, we mix them just to bring them together. Let's see if I can show you. Like this one right here. See how hydrated this dough is? So this dough is going to get 6 stretch and folds before I put it in the Banneton molds and proof it and bake it. All right? So it's a high hydration dough like this that we fold, and then, our regular bread doughs, sandwich bread, cinnamon rolls, they get mixed. Sorry, I just had to clip that bag shut. All right. So when to fold and when to mix a bread dough. It all depends on what you're making. In a nutshell, lean doughs, sourdoughs, they get the stretch and fold, and then are typically, so we're talking a hydration level of maybe 70% plus, and that's 70% liquid to 100% flour. And then think about like a croissant dough, which is usually at about 60% liquid to 100% flour. That's going to get a regular mix without the stretch and fold. So that covers last week's questions. Let's jump in and go to the questions that were posted yesterday. I really appreciate your questions, giving us a start. It's really awesome. So one of our bakers wrote in about her challah, and she said that she was not getting a good rise with active dry yeast. Now, I have taught challah for years, competed with challah, been certified with challah, talk endlessly with my dear friend Chef Gina about challah till our ears bleed, and I'm not surprised. I am not surprised you're not getting a great rise with active dry yeast. Not that you can't, but for you challah bakers out there, give osmotolerant yeast a try. It is the instant yeast made by the SAF brand. You can find it on Amazon. In future, I'll try to find a way to throw a link in here. And it's in the gold package. It's usually a little bit more expensive than the SAF red because it's a good choice for richer doughs and doughs with a higher sugar percentage like challah. So that would be my first recommendation. Not that active dry won't work, but try that osmotolerant yeast. It can be a real game changer. The other thing that happens when we make challah is that it's often we don't consider the temperature of the eggs. If the eggs are ice cold when they go into the mix, that is going to drop the dough temperature, and especially with active dry yeast, everything slows way down. So consider the temperature of your eggs. And how do we warm up eggs? Best thing to do is a few minutes before your mixing time, put them in a bowl of hot tap water in their shells to cover. Set a timer for between 5 and 7 minutes, and then crack them, weigh them, and you're good to go. And one last thing, bakers, just a reminder, if you're separating eggs for a recipe, you want to do that when they're ice cold. All right, so I hope that helps with the challah. Please, baker, who sent in that question, let us know. Oh, BTW, one last thing. Your water temperature for your challah, we've talked about warming up the eggs. It's a good idea if it's about 75, 78 degrees. All right, even up to 80 is okay, especially if you're using the instant osmotolerant yeast, which is very tolerant of temperature fluctuations. All right, now we have a cake question. And this one, I was like, ooh, is Angel Food Cake making a comeback? I guess we can bring it back, right, bakers? So I had this great question about Angel Food Cake. A baker wrote in, and she said that she was having difficulty with knowing when her Angel Food Cakes are done. So just to remind you, Angel Food Cakes are made only with egg whites. They have no chemical leavener, and the only thing that's making the cake rise is steam. We create a good, firm meringue, and then we fold in sifted cake flour, and usually there's a little bit of sugar in with our sifted cake flour. Angel Food Cakes usually have 2 increments of sugar. So how do you know when they're done? And they're baked. They can be, classically, they are baked in a tube pan. And the pan is not sprayed, though it's a good idea to line the top of the Angel Food Cake pan with a circle of parchment paper. All right, so you put them in the oven, and you do not open that oven door for 30 minutes. And the reason for that is that cake needs time and heat to set, and for that steam to expand, and it's going to grow up the side of the pan. First check in 30 minutes. Crack the oven door open, and it should begin to look like a beautiful pale golden brown. If it all looks soft, close the oven door and set the timer for another 7 minutes. When you do test your cakes, you want to remove them from the oven, close the oven door quickly, have your tester test the Angel Food Cake. If the tester comes out clean, you're good to go. If there's still a little moisture attached to the tester, put it back in the oven for another 5 to 7 minutes and test again. The angel food cake became popular after the invention of the rotary egg beater. Anybody remember playing with one of those as a kid? Make a comment if you remember that. Maybe you still have one. And old recipes will tell you to test that cake with a broom straw. So now you know, if you can't find your cake tester, you can always use a broom straw. And then finally, we had a great question about sweet doughs. And this came from one of our bakers who I know is a former culinary student of mine. So I'm going to shout out there. So this baker asked about sweet doughs, specifically king cake. He had made a king cake and the crumb structure had fallen apart. It didn't hold together very well. He gave me the percentage of the fat. Sweet doughs always have butter in them or some sort of fat at 30%. That's not a problem at all. The dough can take 30% fat. If those of you who love to make brioche, you can be working at a 50% fat when you're making brioche. All right, so how would we handle the sweet dough for our king cake? Well, first of all, sweet doughs get an intensive mix, which means they're usually mixed on low speed for 4 minutes, and then medium-low for another 4 minutes, or depending on your mixer, all the way up to medium. We really need to develop that gluten. But the key is to mix all the ingredients except the butter for about 3 minutes to develop some of the gluten before you add the butter. That will be a game changer because you get a little bit of gluten development before the butter comes in, and what fat does to gluten is it inhibits its formation. So if we give it a head start before we add our fat, we have a much better shot at having a really beautifully formed dough and a lovely, lofty crumb structure for our sweet doughs. So I really hope that you try that out, and I think that's going to be your fix right there. Yay! That's going to be, I'm reading your comment from our baker. He's watching, and give that a try. It's going to just really make a difference. All right. So that was it for former questions, and you are so welcome. And I'm going to see what other questions we have here. I am looking here. Please, if you have questions, throw them in right now, please. So that we have, I could talk about yeast for a while, but yeah, please put in your questions. All right. Yeah, that's going to be the game changer there. Questions? Anybody? I am seeing people joining. All right, and here, our baker with the angel food cake said that her cake tester was clean. Maybe I need to test in several places. Yes. Now, that just brings up something great for us to talk about. When you test, so the angel food cake was baked in the tube pan, right? The pan with the hole in the center and the straight sides and the bottom that pops out. And sometimes they have feet because angel food cakes are cooled upside down in the pan. Okay, so you want to make sure you are testing if right in the center, if you look at the circle with the hole in it, right in the center. And definitely test in a couple different places because you might have a hot or cold spot in your oven, and you might have, which I say this all the time, It doesn't, all ovens have their little quirks. No, it seems to be no matter what you spend, they all have their quirks. So yes, test all around the angel food cake. I mean, you don't have to stab it 10,000 times, but just definitely right in the middle of the, well, I'm not doing a very good job of but right in the middle of where the cake is. All right. We have a question about cinnamon roll dough fermenting really slowly. And the question is, did I kill the yeast? The answer is probably not. You probably did not kill your yeast. But again, there could have been some of the ingredients during mixing where the ingredients might have been on the cooler side. So what happens is the yeast slows down. It slows way down. So that can be a reason why your rich dough, your cinnamon roll dough, which is a sweet dough, a rich dough, wasn't fermenting. And to piggyback onto that, our sweet doughs and our rich doughs, they're not aggressive risers. I mean, maybe in July when it's hotter than Hades in our kitchens, they will really grow during bulk fermentation. But they are weighed down with sugar, with butter, with eggs, and so it takes them a little bit more to expand, which is a reason why you may notice that the yeast percentage is a little bit higher in a sweet dough than it is in a lean dough like a French bread or a pizza dough. And even if you're not calculating percentages, even if you're using a more old school recipe, you'll notice that your recipe for cinnamon roll dough or sweet dough will have a little bit extra yeast added to it. All right, so now just really quickly about commercial yeast in 2022. Commercial yeast, yeast that we buy in the supermarket, yeast that we order from online sources, has a good shelf life. If it's stored properly, and the way my recommendation is when you get your package of yeast, open it up, put it in an airtight container, and keep it in the freezer. It will keep for 2 years in an airtight container in your freezer. What I do, because I'm obviously baking bread all the time, I don't buy bread. I bake all my own bread. I think if baking is an act of self-care, making your own bread is one of the best things you can do for yourself. Talk about an act of self-love, right? Instead of eating store-bought. Sorry, that was a tangent. I'm good at tangents. Where was I? Oh, the yeast. So yeast in 2022, unless it's been somehow abused, it will be really rare that it is not still alive. If you want to make sure, dissolve it in part of the liquid and make sure the liquid isn't cold, super cold. Take the chill off of it. Let it sit for 5 minutes and you should see that it's dissolved. It doesn't have to look like a science experiment, but that is what you're looking for. You know, a little bit of life. There are so many mythologies about yeast. It's not even funny. But trust me, please trust me, that most of the yeast that we're buying is perfectly good. Check oh my God. Check the inspiration date. No, let me rephrase. Check the expiration date and then be inspired to go home and bake cinnamon rolls or a beautiful loaf of bread. And then I've got a question about a good beginner bake. I just want to make sure I've caught the questions. So we have a croissant question, and then I'll go to the beginning baking question. So one of our bakers has asked, the butter leaked out of her croissants. She baked them at 375, which is our go-to temperature for croissants. So that's perfect. Croissants love 375. So what could have happened? There's 3 points in the process where we can compromise our butter layers. Number 1, if the croissant dough is overmixed, you'll notice in croissant recipes the dough gets a short mix. Usually it's mixed in about 3 minutes because we continue to develop gluten in the rolling and folding process, otherwise known as laminating. So if the dough is overmixed, then the butter, it's kind of, picture it as concrete. So the butter layer doesn't pillow into it nicely. It just kind of comes up against a stone and it runs out. This might sound like a weird analogy, but I got a ton of weird analogies. And what I always think of about overworked croissant dough and those layers of butter, it's like a concrete parking structure, is just going to run right out. So that's number 1. Number 2, if the butter layer is too warm when it's incorporated, it should be cool to the touch, it should be pliable but not crack, and it should not look spreadable. And then also too, if the dough is rolled out and folded, if it becomes too warm during that process and the shaping process, your butter can run out. Also, last, I told you there were 3, it might have been 4, if it is proofed at too high of a temperature, then the butter can run out during baking. Okay, so that's that. Great question, thank you. We have a question. I am a beginner baker. Which bread would be a good one to try? I think a simple bread, kind of like I'm making today, 4 ingredients would be the best to try. Like a simple French bread or a, just which you can shape simply into a round or into rolls. And I will be everything's always a blog post for me. I'm always trying to maintain my website, bakingwithcolette.com. So I'll have that one posted, probably not this week, but next week. So please watch for that. But that's what I would recommend. Flatbreads are another excellent place to start. They usually have a shorter proofing time, so you can get to a beautiful result a little bit more quickly. And that always, I think, is a great confidence builder, and then move on to more complicated breads. All right, so now let's see. I think we have time for one more question. And then one of our bakers has asked, I forgot my yeast in my kitchen overnight. Is it still okay to use? If it's in the package or in the container, in its powdered form, then it should be fine. If you've already mixed it with the liquid and let it sit out, then definitely start over, because it is more than likely exhausted itself. Commercial yeast can go from 0 to 1 trillion cells in a short amount of time. And if it's left to sit too long, ideally 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes is ideal, then it just becomes exhausted, and it gives off so much carbon dioxide gas that it's no longer going to work in your dough. All right, just going to scroll for questions. Let's see. Well, and I just got a thank you from one of our bakers. This was my goal. I have answered questions as just part of my daily life since my first Craftsy class in 2012. And obviously when I was teaching, but in culinary schools, but it was such an organic part of our lives, I don't think we even thought of it. So I would say when Craftsy was, it's still going, of course, but in its heyday, I would answer as many as 20 questions a day. And I absolutely really wanted, I miss it. And so this is my way of connecting with you. And I cannot thank you enough for joining me. We will do this again next week. I'm going to archive this probably on my website. That's the task for this afternoon. Oh, I see one more quick question that I'll do, and then we will sign off. There'll be another call for questions Friday of next week, and we'll do this again tomorrow. All right, one quick final question. Is there a difference between whole wheat flour and whole wheat pastry flour? Oh my goodness, absolutely. There is a big difference. Great question. Whole wheat pastry flour has less protein than whole wheat flour. So if you try to make a batch of whole wheat bread with whole wheat pastry flour, it doesn't have the protein content to give you proper structure. So it wouldn't rise very much and it would be a big disappointment. On the flip side, whole wheat flour has good protein content, so it's perfect for making bread. Normally, we also use a little regular bread flour to make a lighter whole wheat loaf with that. And so on the flip side, what would happen? Oh, that's my timer. What would happen if you made a whole wheat, let's say a whole wheat tart crust with regular whole wheat flour? It might be a little bit heavy. All right, everyone. We've gone our 30 minutes. Once again, a huge thank you for joining me and making the first episode of the Dough Doctor such a success. I will see you next Saturday. Bye. Take care, everyone. See you next week.